Hi everybody, this is the week 3 wrap-up as promised on the Blackboard site, and this lecture is just a wrap-up for this week. I only want to hit just a couple points, so really this lecture should only take about 10 minutes, but I would ask that you bear with me here because I think I have a couple important points to make on this week's exercise. Well, this is an example of the power interest grid that we did as we examined stakeholders. So remember that on this power interest grid, we talk about power going up, or I'm sorry, interest going up this way and power going across this way from left to right. So in this grid, we have subjects, players, the crowd, and context setters. So players are the people with the highest level of power and the highest level of interest, whereas the crowd are the people with the lowest level of interest and the lowest level of power. So here's some examples of a power interest grid that not exactly like some of yours, but really it's kind of based on a lot of different inputs over the times I've taught this course, including some of your inputs as well, a lot of your inputs. So almost universally, a lot of people said that riders represented subjects. That is, riders have a lot of interest in using the bus. Sometimes they have no choice, but do they really have power? A lot of people, and you can kind of see it here, I don't circle it, but is Metro employees. So are Metro employees actually subjects? On players, a lot of you pointed to elected leaders, the City Council of Omaha, for example, the Omaha mayor. So you said the Omaha mayor was a player because she had, a high interest in Metro and high power. Now, what's interesting about this isn't always the universal view that is received when I do this exercise. So sometimes people might call elected leaders context setters, people with high power but lower interest. The Federal Transit Administration might be a context setter. Sometimes people say customers are in the crowd. Now, why is this? The point I made to a lot of you when I graded your discussion board was exactly this point. These identifications of stakeholders of the organizations are really open to interpretation. And what this means is that if you had a notional organization and you went to every member of the organization and you asked them what their view of stakeholders are, what you're likely to find is that people have different views. And even if we use something like this power interest grid, you would find that people in your organization have different views. This is very important, and here's why. And I'm going to talk about this in the next slide here. So one thing I want to let you know is this idea, this power interest grid is only one way of mapping stakeholders. There are others, and in fact this is going to come up when I ask you to do short analysis number 1, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. I'm not asking you to use a power interest grid in that stakeholder analysis. I'm asking you to use a different method of mapping stakeholders. So the important point is there are various ways to examine who the stakeholders of the organization are. The second thing is that when we're talking about the power and the interest of stakeholders, this is often open to interpretation, as you saw on those quadrants that I was showing in the first part of this lecture. Some people may say that the City Council of Omaha is, quote, a player in Metro. Some people may say it's a context setter. Again, what this points to is that different people within the organization have different perspectives on stakeholders. The third point I'd like to make is it's really important for organizations to become more and more precise about who exactly their stakeholders are and what interests they have in the organization. Remember, we said that a stakeholder is somebody who has a claim on the organization. But what is that claim exactly, and who are those stakeholders? So, for example, if let's say I've used this example before, a nonprofit art museum, and I want to say that my customers, my people who come through the door, are stakeholders. And indeed, I think you can make that argument. However, are there different kinds of customers? So, for example, are there customers that would be interested in buying an annual membership to the organization? Are there customers who happen to be people who are just visiting the city once a year or less, and they happen to come to my museum? Are there customers who might be school groups who take tours? So it's very important to start stratifying these stakeholders, and so you can see that the more you know about the organization, the more important it becomes to stratify the stakeholders. For the kinds of exercises we did here in the class, it's a little hard to do, but if it's your organization, you can see why it might be important to stratify those stakeholders and be more specific about who they are. And it's important to understand the roles of the various stakeholders. Does this vary by the kind of organization we're talking about? A lot of you mentioned Metro employees. Well, what if we had again, a nonprofit organization that relied on volunteers? What are the roles of our employees versus the roles of our volunteers? And how do those roles affect their interests as stakeholders in the organization? And so finally, you can see now, I think, how stakeholders and mandates are related. Remember, we talked about mandates as being these informal and formal must-dos of an organization. But can you see now how stakeholders are driving some of the mandates? And now this week, coming up in week 4, as we explore the environment using a SWOT exercise, I think you're going to begin to see how strategic planning, as I keep saying, is an exercise in organizational self-discovery. So what we've discovered so far in our journey is we've talked about mandates, so you're discovering what you must do. We've talked about stakeholders, so you're understanding who the people are that have a claim on the organization, and now we're going to talk about the environment, and so you're going to understand. And so what last are the environmental factors is internally and externally that affect the organization. Don't forget that the term project proposal is due this week, September 17th. I did move that from September 10th. Coming up the week after that is short analysis paper number 1, and again, that's going to be a stakeholder analysis. But we're not going to use the power interest grid. We're going to use a map from page 414 of the Bryson text. So you're going to want to look at the assignment tab, and you're going to want to reread those applicable parts about stakeholder analysis to complete that assignment. And then your term project interview plan is going to be due October 8th, but the week prior to that, that's going to be week 6. I'm going to give you a chance to try out your interview questions on your classmates. We're going to make it a discussion board topic. And again, as always, please do stay in touch with me on any difficulties you're having. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to week 4.